Watch this vidcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Welcome back, Horror Hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show Podcast.
I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I'm James Rivera. We have a lot of news and movies to discuss, but before we get to either of those things, we have some updates with regards to our television series.
Last week we said we were coming back December 6th to finish the season out with 4 episodes. We're going to cut it down to 3 episodes that start Friday the 13th, December. Since we had to incorporate one of the episodes into these, it's going to be 3 nice, big, and fat episodes.
Probably the longest episodes we've ever had of the show.
Yeah, so we're going to...
meaty.
We're going to make sure to finish the second season on a strong note and give you guys some really good, entertaining final 3 episodes. I think it'll be worth the wait. And again, that's on the American Horrors channel.
Yes.
Roku channel. So, let's get to...
Horror show news.
Blumhouse's Black Christmas remake to be rated PG-13. Ugh.
Blumhouse is releasing a horror film based on the Fantasy Island TV series.
Blumhouse again, and Paramount sets new release date for Paranormal Activity, another Paranormal Activity film.
Eli Roth's History of Horror to return for second season on AMC.
And Ryan Murphy teases season 10 of American Horror Story might be the last.
And we sadly report that Dr. Sleep underperformed at the box office.
The first story's got me kind of pissed off this week, so I'm going to try to not to be so triggered, but I must admit I'm upset over this. Blumhouse's Black Christmas remake is going to be rated PG-13, and this is the first Black Christmas that's going to be rated this. The first one, of course, was rated R, and then that crappy remake that some people actually like a few years ago, that one was rated R. And this one was PG-13. Now, it's one thing to call it PG, to make it PG-13, but it's another thing when I found out why. Director April Wolf tweeted, "Here's the deal. We wrote it with an R in mind. When they did the test screenings, it was clear that this movie needed to be available to a younger female audience because the subject matter is timely. Also, I want to indoctrinate girls into horror. Doesn't make it any less vicious."
Yes,
I beg
it does.
to differ. I beg to differ.
Okay, so here's my biggest problem with it. I don't have a problem with PG-13 horror movies per se, and we've seen some good ones. But for a PG-13 horror movie to be successful in the way that I like it to be, it usually has to be something a little bit more paranormal, based off of atmosphere. Now, don't get me wrong, slasher films should have atmosphere, but a slasher film should be, and always should be, rated R. I'm not interested in seeing a slasher movie that's neutered. I might have been a little bit more open to this if this is how they initially designed it going in. But it just sounds like nonsense to me. The reasoning is because of test screenings. I've always been suspicious of test screenings. I find that test screenings actually ruin movies because instead of getting a vision from an artist, you have to mass market it. As Scorsese said recently, these movies are marketed, remarketed, vetted, tested, re-vetted before they're released for consumption. The reasoning doesn't really convince me very much either. She says it needs to be available to a younger female audience because the subject matter is timely. I want to indoctrinate girls into horror. Here's my issue with that. In my years being a horror fan and going to horror conventions and meeting and talking to people in horror, I've found that just as many girls are into horror, if not more so than males. I feel like a lot of females absolutely love the horror genre. I know several of them myself. The conventions are filled with them. We're seeing a lot of rise of female directors in the horror genre, like April Wolf herself is one of these people. Yeah. Jennifer Kent, Coralie Farragut. And most of the good horror movies this year have had female leads. There has been some problem with misogyny in the horror genre in the past. This whole we need to indoctrinate girls into horror excuse is not something that I buy. 50% at the very least of hardcore fandom is comprised of females. 50%. I would say amongst casual moviegoers, that number is even higher. When you think of date nights, it's usually the female who decides to go see a horror film.
I don't think she's given girls enough credit.
Yeah.
And I don't know why she assumes that young girls don't watch horror. I don't know where she's getting that assumption, but it's not a good reason to water down your movie. It's just not.
I'll wait till I hear more things. I'm always suspicious of test screenings because who do we get to these test screenings? A lot of times the people don't know what the movies are. They're not even necessarily always the audience that's going to watch these movies. So what you do, especially with a horror movie, you get a bunch of normies dictating what a horror movie is going to be like, and what you end up doing is disappointing or pissing off the actual horror fan base.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
Blumhouse is releasing a horror film based on the Fantasy Island TV series. This is very novel and intriguing. For anybody who doesn't know, Fantasy Island was a TV series. What era was this? The 80s?
70s.
70s, where everybody went to this island and where people got to live out their fantasies on an island. Of course, it was wholesome and clean cut, nothing pornographic.
Yeah.
So the synopsis for this reads, the enigmatic Mr. Rourke, played by Michael Pena, makes the secret dreams of his lucky guests come true at a luxurious but remote tropical resort. But when the fantasies turn into nightmares, the guests have to solve the island's mystery in order to escape with their lives. It's directed by Jeff Wadlow, written by Gillian Jacobs, Chris Roach, and the director Wadlow himself. Based on the series created by Gene Levitt. It's almost like the Banana Splits movie, taking a classic television series that has absolutely nothing to do with horror and putting a horror spin on it. And we are going to actually watch that trailer on the podcast.
If I can find the play button here. I don't see it. There it goes.
Fantasy Island official trailer.
There is an elevator. In the elevator, you press the button to the floor with no name.
Ooh, it looks like a nice movie so far.
Behind those doors,
I see Lucy Hale as a blonde now.
you always trend first.
Nothing about the trailer so far says horror.
It looks very much like the
From
show.
the producers of Get Out and Halloween.
It looks like the series starting out.
You will be our guests. Here, anything and everything is possible.
A lot of sexy, good-looking people.
Service.
Which you would
Not
expect
everything is possible.
from a movie called Fantasy Island.
Yeah.
I'm Mr. Rourke. Let
Michael
me-
Pena looking doughy and sinister.
Fantasy Island.
So Michael Pena is the Ricardo Montalban character. But I don't see Hervé Villachez anywhere, the little midget.
Fantasy involves
Or the little
most of
person.
your life. Holograms.
They play.
Somewhere you died.
Holograms?
So, what's your fantasy?
Is there a James Dean hologram in this?
Your life is about to change.
Get a bit of a Cabin in the Woods vibe.
A little bit. Awkward stares.
That is a really good hologram.
There is only one fantasy per guest.
One fantasy per guest.
You must see your fantasy through.
It brought her back to life.
Oh, that's creepy. Bringing back a dead little girl.
Oh my god. That's really her.
Torture porn elements in here?
Water torture.
Is that Hostel?
What is this place?
People die here.
Just running through some
Let's
woods.
see what we asked for.
That guy looked really fucking creepy.
Jump
We
scare.
have our own fantasies.
More jump scares. Violence. Fire. Strange looking person.
Friend. I've always wanted to hear you say
I'm intrigued.
Yeah. That's not my Fantasy Island, but I don't mind.
No, I'm pretty sure this is going to be better than that Fantasy Island.
Shut up.
I never watched the show. I've been aware of it and I know what it is. I've seen clips of it growing up, but I've never actually seen a full episode of Fantasy Island. So it's very interesting that they're reaching this far back for a premise for a horror movie.
Yeah.
But it fits. It makes sense. The Fantasy Island, the concept of it is ripe for horror.
Blumhouse seems to be doing this a lot. They like to take old IPs like this and kind of re-engineer them for a modern audience.
For a horror audience. Well, it didn't give a rating yet, so let's hope that Blumhouse doesn't pull another Black Christmas.
So the next story is Blumhouse once again teams with Paramount and sets a new release date for Paranormal Activity. The new Paranormal Activity is set for March 19th, 2021, but there's no title or details.
Well, they have a lot of time. This isn't going to be coming out for over a year.
Yeah.
I thought The Ghost Dimension was the last chapter, but I feel like with franchises like this, it's never the last chapter. They get one that's very successful, there's sequels that become kind of a tradition for horror fans.
Yeah.
And after 5 or 6 sequels, they stop making money and fans start losing interest. And in order to get the fans interested in it, the studio announces the final chapter. There's always a final chapter, and it makes them more money because people think it's the final chapter. But once they've had so many years to let it rest, they come back. They always come back again.
They're not going to wait to lose the rights to it and turn it over to somebody else to reboot. They're going to reboot their own shit while they still got the rights to it. I think that's why they're doing it so
we don't
fast.
even know if this is a reboot, a sequel, a prequel, a remake. We don't know anything about it other than that it's a part of the Paranormal Activity franchise.
I mean, it has to be a reboot to be
Successful.
taken seriously at all.
Because I feel like the mythology has gotten too convoluted at this point to continue it. Just
Yeah.
like even like Halloween, that's a good example of the mythology behind Michael Myers and his origins became so unnecessarily convoluted that they
Yeah.
just had to wipe the slate clean. If it's a sequel, I wouldn't be surprised if they went the route that seems to be a trend these days of ignoring all the sequels nobody likes and just paying attention to either the first one or the first two. Terminator did it, Halloween did it.
Yeah, in Ghost Dimension, they were just beating a dead horse already. So they have to revitalize it somehow or breathe some new life into it, give some originality to it, because the story they were going with was really good, I thought. And I thought the best one of the series was 5, the marked ones, which a lot of people hate. But I think that's when it stopped being good.
My favorite is still the first one.
Hi, I'm Elliot. You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
Eli Roth's History of Horror to return for a second season on AMC.
All right.
Yay! Eli Roth said, "I'm so thrilled to be continuing this historic series with AMC. In season 1, we had the most incredible conversations with the top creators in the field who really helped fans around the world appreciate the horror genre in a new light. We will look forward to going even deeper in season 2, bringing out the A-listers to share their stories with everyone for all time, and adding more and more films to the canon. AMC is the perfect network to partner with on a passion project like this, and we can't wait to get started." So season 2 is going to have 6 episodes. The topics are going to be magic-wielding witches, which is pretty awesome because witch films might be my favorite subgenre of horror. Misshapen monsters, infamously evil youngsters, hell houses, and body horror, which is, of course, David Cronenberg's territory.
Yes.
I'm really excited about this. I really hope this gets renewed for a 3rd season, because as much as I loved the first season of the History of Horror, my only problem with it is I felt it only covered American horror films. The U.S. is obviously the biggest producer of films and popular films, but there's a whole other world of horror out there beyond the U.S., and there's some really unique stuff. I would like a season 3, since they're already going so deep on season 2, I would like a season 3 to tackle Italian horror, giallo films, Asian horror, which is a whole other brand of horror, Takashi Miike, the Ringu, Ju-on, The Grudge. Eli Roth is a big fan of giallo films and Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci and artists like that.
There's even a lot of American films that they miss because people don't realize how rich the horror genre is and how many great movies are in the pantheon of every single subgenre. They're going to have to gloss over something, and that's not the fault of Eli Roth. It's not the fault of the show.
It's just the nature of how sprawling horror is, which is why a series like this is perfect for multiple seasons because there's a lot to dive into. I'm really excited mostly for the body horror one. I'm really interested into seeing what that one's going to be like. That's going to be really fascinating.
Yeah.
But like I said, more foreign horror in season 3, please. And I think one of the best things is all the interviewees they have on this.
Yeah.
Like you get people like Jamie Lee Curtis, Quentin Tarantino, and they're discussing horror films. It's the variety of people that also helps with it too.
So our next story is Ryan Murphy teases season 10 of American Horror Story and says it might be the last. Now he says a couple different things in this interview with Deadline. The first thing he says is it's the potential last season, and he talks of reuniting old cast members. So Ryan Murphy told Deadline that fans will love season 10 because it's about reuniting fan favorite actors, because it might be our last season. It's the last season we have contracted at FX, so I've been quietly reaching out to various people. Some people I haven't reached out to yet because I was like, do I have a role for them? So far, everybody I reached out to said yes, so that's been great. But then later on in an interview, he says that FX chairman John Landgraf has always been incredibly honorable about American Horror Story, and he would obviously like to keep it going. And I'd like to keep it going. We're in the middle of negotiations about Beyond Season 10. We have had conversations about the show going up to 20 seasons. And he says that if FX says no, he will talk to Netflix about taking the franchise to them.
So I'll be honest with you. I don't think this is going to be the last season of American Horror Story, and I don't think he's going to have to take it to Netflix either. American Horror Story has become a big part of the FX brand. It's like an annual tradition for horror fans, where every year horror fans get to gripe, bitch, moan, complain, and praise and get excited over the latest season of American Horror Story. There's always a lot of arguments swirling, but it's consistently good with ratings year after year. It never seems to falter as far as the ratings and the popularity goes. I'm generally not a fan of stretching out TV shows beyond a certain point because of how stale they become with the storyline.
Yeah.
This is one of those series where it has more potential to go to 20 seasons only because they get to push the reset button. Every season, they get to push the reset button, have a whole new cast of people, a whole new set of characters, completely different style of story. And because there's so many different subgenres of horror, there's a lot to tackle. I was myself surprised when they announced that the season 9 would be a slasher film.
Yeah.
Would be a slasher. I never thought that American Horror Story would tackle that. So who knows where it could lead as far as that goes. But I can see this. I don't see this ending in season 10. And in fact, I highly doubt it's going to end with season 10.
Yeah, judging by what Ryan Murphy said in this interview, it seems like he's bringing back a lot of some of the old fan favorite actors. I think he wants to finish the current cycle of American Horror Story with those type of actors, and I think he's having them come back. Let me have you guys come back for this one last season of this pool of actors, and I think he's going to move on in a different direction after that. I don't see him stopping that juggernaut anytime soon. And this is one of those shows that's very divisive, but all the fans on both sides that love it and hate it are all watching it.
Yeah. I honestly can say that I feel like half of the American Horror Story audience hates it and is there to complain and moan and bitch and cry about it, which happens pretty much every season. But they still tune in, don't they? They still give it ratings.
And they're just like us, where if we don't enjoy a season at all, when the next season comes up, we're still excited for it.
Because it's going to be something completely different.
Yeah.
Shut up.
So Dr. Sleep, Mike Flanagan's hotly anticipated sequel to The Shining, underperforms at the box office. The film was projected to make a 25 to 30 million opening, but only made 14 million, which is well below expectations. The film was also expected to be the number one of the weekend, and it lost the box office crown to Midway, a Roland Emmerich World War II film that was heavily underpromoted and heavily under-advertised, and I'd never even heard of it until they announced that it was the number one movie of the weekend. But it did have the benefit of being released on the weekend leading up to Veterans Day, so I guess that kind of makes sense that it ended up coming out on top. That's very disappointing to hear that Dr. Sleep didn't do as well as I thought it would do. I didn't think it was going to be as big as it, to be very clear, but with such an iconic property as The Shining attached to it, I thought it was going to be a solid moneymaker, that it would make a little bit more than this. Part of me feels like it's the timing. It came out a week after Halloween.
Yeah.
Which I don't think really helped. This would have really benefited from being released during October, during the Halloween season, or at least the few days before Halloween would have probably been a better release date. And instead, the Terminator movie released on Halloween, and who wants to go see I did actually see the Terminator, but who wants to go see an action movie on Halloween? That's a very poor release date.
Yeah.
And that movie also underperformed too. So I honestly think if they had just flipped the release dates on these movies, they both would have done a lot better. A Terminator action franchise film is better for the post-Halloween season leading up to Thanksgiving and Christmas, and a horror movie is always going to be a little bit better to get during the month when everybody's fucking excited for horror movies. And is The Shining not a Halloween horror staple every year?
Yeah.
That would have drawn a lot more people if they would have released it a week earlier. But my feeling is that Warner Brothers didn't want it to step on the Joker's toes. So they wanted each film to maximize their profits. But it turned out to be not such a great strategy after all.
Whatever strategy they used on this, it backfired on them, and it's sad because it's a really solid film.
And with that being said, we are actually going to get into our reviews portion of the podcast, and we are going to start off by talking about Dr. Sleep.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
Yeah, we just went to see it. James said watched it already, but I had seen it for the first time just before the podcast. And
so I got to see 2 screenings of Dr. Sleep. And all in all, a fucking damn fine film. I was really impressed, and Mike Flanagan really pulled it off. He managed something that was very difficult to do. Is what he did was he took the Kubrick version of The Shining, which Stephen King hates, and reconciled it with Stephen King's world and made it compatible. This is much of a reintegration and readaptation of The Shining as it is a Dr. Sleep adaptation, because a lot of what King didn't like about Kubrick's film was the coldness, the ending, some of the changes. I'm not going to reveal what the changes are, but he rectifies them to make the Kubrick version and the King version absolutely compatible, and retroactively imbues Kubrick's Shining with more warmth that it didn't have, and reinserted the alcoholism theme to a much greater degree. And for long periods of the movie, especially during the opening and the closing sequences, more so during the opening sequences, I think he does a really good job in the opening of aping the style and the feel of The Shining, the way that it's directed, the way that it moves, the color palette, having Alex Esso play Wendy Torrance, pulling off her best Shelley Duvall impersonation that she could pull out. And man, she sounds just like fucking Shelley Duvall when she's going, "Daddy, Doc."
Yeah.
I could have swore that was Shelley Duvall's voice coming out of Alex Esso. So you could tell she really studied it to try to replicate, to say this is the same universe. And what I loved most about this movie is that it's a vastly different film than The Shining is. They have very little in common, and it feels like its own thing. And to me, it feels very much like a Mike Flanagan film. Spooky, scary, character-driven, emotional, heavy on story that happens to take place in the Kubrick universe. So I felt he was successful at keeping true to himself and making his film feel like it could be part of the same universe as Kubrick's version of The Shining, which is a very difficult feat to pull off. I can see why Stephen King agreed to it, because he retroactively made Stanley Kubrick's The Shining more compatible with Stephen King without changing anything that makes Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining special.
Yeah, and it could have very well been overkill with all the Shining stuff, but it wasn't. It never takes you out of the movie, and I kind of thought it would take me out of the movie seeing other actors play the ghost from the hotel, and Wendy Torrance, and even Jack Nicholson.
I feel like Alex Esso did the best job, though.
And then Henry Thomas playing the Jack Nicholson character.
Luckily, he doesn't have too much dialogue, because it's hard to imitate Jack Nicholson's voice properly.
Yeah.
So you mostly get like a quick scene with some dialogue and a couple of flashbacks, but it's used sparingly enough that you believe it's still the same thing. And that's another thing I like about this. I think the only shot that's taken directly from Kubrick's movie is the elevators, the blood coming out of the elevator.
Yeah.
From what I understand, that's the only shot that they wholly recycled. Everything else, he completely reshot certain scenes in flashbacks of The Shining. A lot of people might complain, but I think it's a better route to use than going the CGI way. I feel like that would have been more distracting.
Yeah.
It's better to do it in the traditional way and to bring on look-alike actors.
And it was excellent casting with Ewan McGregor as Danny Torrance, and Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat. She was just as awesome as everyone's saying that she is. Kylie Curran as Abra Stone. She's a little girl with The Shining that has all the power. And then Jocelyn Donahue and Alex Esso. Jocelyn Donahue is the girl from House of the Devil. Mm-hmm. She plays the little girl's mom. And then Alex Esso plays Danny Torrance's mom, of course, like we just said. But I like seeing those two in a movie, and it's young horror starlets that I thought were the darlings of horror, and it's kind of funny to see both of them play moms now.
It's a believable continuation of the series. It's a lot more supernatural than Kubrick's version of The Shining is. Kubrick's version is supernatural, but it spends a lot of time trying to trick you into thinking that it might be psychological. This is more upfront from the beginning. It's more Stephen King. You could definitely feel a little bit more of Stephen King's influence on it. I liked Rebecca Ferguson a lot in this movie. I thought she was a fantastic villain. She plays Rose the Hat. She's part of a cult, the leader of a cult that calls themselves the True Knot. And basically what they are is vampires, but they don't feed off of blood. They take the shine, they feed off of the shine in people who are special, particularly children, because this is a really interesting way to do this is, I guess, the way that they suck the shine out of people, it looks like they're secreting steam from the body and sucking it up, and that's how they get their powers.
They give a shotgun hit of a soul. I've never seen a shotgun hit with a soul. Rose the Hat breathes it in and kind of breathes it into the subject. She's
like shotgunning the way that people smoke weed and blow it into each other's mouths when they're trying to get high. There's a very hippie-ish look to a lot of the cult, too.
Yeah.
And I think that helps them look deceptive because they just look like a band of roadies from the 70s. They look like... You got that, too, right?
Yeah,
They look like they... And, of course, they were alive in the 70s, so they've retained their style.
And I loved following that whole band of
villains, evildoers.
One thing I knew was going to be in this one, I knew it was going to be deeply emotional, and it really was, especially when Danny Torrance, they call him Dr. Sleep because he helps ease people into death at a nursing home.
At a hospice.
Yeah, and I thought those were very deeply emotional.
That's another big difference from the original version of The Shining that Stanley Kubrick did. I don't think Kubrick would have ever outright did anything that emotional just because Kubrick was not very sentimental at all. He was a little bit more cynical as far as human nature was concerned. So there's definitely a lot of decisions in this movie that Kubrick never would have made, yet still feel compatible to that world.
Yeah, and to me it felt like a few different types of movies in one movie. It had a lot of things that satisfy me about horror. Because I like deeply emotional horror. I like dramatic aspects of horror. I love showdowns between good and evil. I love action horror. I love things with with crazy kills, kind of disturbing kills. And it had all that, and it had good scares in it.
One of the most disturbing elements of the recent It films was the deaths of the children in them, because the way that Pennywise lures them, and you feel bad because they're little kids. There's one particular scene in this movie where a kid is killed by the True Knot, and it's a lot more harsh, and it's a little bit harder to bear than than all of the kills in It. I would say.
Yeah.
All of the kills. Because one of them is the actor Jacob Tremblay, who was in a Room and Before I Wake. Another Mike Flanagan. When he's being murdered and slaughtered by this group, he lets out these really blood-curdling screams where it doesn't seem like a little kid acting terrified. It seems like how a little kid would react if you were being brutally slaughtered and tortured and put through pain by a group of vicious predators. And I think that might turn some people off, or that might be a little unexpected. I know the first time I saw it, I did not expect a child death scene that brutal, or to stretch it out as long as they do. It's not particularly graphic, but I feel like it's emotionally damaging because of what the way that Jacob Tremblay acts the scene out.
Yeah.
And you don't see too much going on, but you don't really see the actual details of what they're doing to him because of the way it's shot. I don't think they would have been able to have gotten away with that in the first place and still retain an R rating to torture a kid and show in detail how they're torturing him. You can tell what they're doing to him, and it's a little bit angering to see that happen to a child, but it doesn't feel like exploitation. It feels like it's necessary to the story.
And it added intensity to the scene that the little girl was connected to the boy at the time. So she was feeling what he was feeling, and she was frightened and screaming along with him. Mm-hmm. And that kind of added to the tension of the scene, I thought.
Stanley Kubrick's film was a very static movie, the way that it moved along and the way that the scenes bled into each other. Title cards announcing a different day. This one's title cards announcing different parts of the U.S. because this is a much more sprawling story than The Shining is. And the way that they incorporate the old score of The Shining into the new one helps to retain the feeling that this is the same world, and there's a little bit of that eeriness that seeps into it, or you could see some of the spirit of The Shining into it.
And I felt that it never leaned on the connection to The Shining at all. I felt that actually the strongest moments of the movie had nothing to do with The Shining, with the original Shining.
I agree. And as the trailers have already pointed out, most of the third act takes place at the Overlook Hotel. And it's a very detailed and thorough restoration of the iconography that Kubrick set up in his movie. It feels like it's the exact same hotel, even though it's not. They had to rebuild it. But they use the same blueprints So it looks like the same place, but run down after 40 years, what it would look like if it was unkempt and untaken care of for 40 years, if it was just left there to rot. And while I did like all of that stuff, and it worked within the context of the movie, the strongest parts of the movie are when it's doing its own thing, not when it's paying tribute to The Shining or playing in Kubrick's playground or backyard. Like I said, I feel like it's successful, but let's be honest, you're never going to recreate the feeling that Kubrick gives you in The Shining, that bone deep eeriness from scene to scene that just radiates terror. Yeah. I didn't get that off of Mike Flanagan's trip through the Overlook Hotel, even though all the things are there and everything's in place. But then again, he's not Kubrick. Still, I felt like it was satisfying to revisit it, even though that wasn't the best element of the movie. It was good enough that it didn't do any damage, and it was still kind of interesting fan service.
The ghosts felt like the same ghosts that were in The Shining, but none of the visuals, it looked like a visual representation of The Shining instead of trying to exactly copy it.
Mike Flanagan was smart not to recycle a bunch of shots from the movie, because who wants to do secondhand cinema?
Yeah.
And if I directed it, I wouldn't want to just throw a bunch of Kubrick scenes into my film, because I'd feel like that's not me. That's a fucking cheat, or that's cheap. Yeah. So I think he did the smart thing by recreating the scenes using lookalike actors.
I didn't read Dr. Sleep, but kudos to Stephen King for where he took this story. I thought it was very compelling, and it was consistently compelling all the way through.
You see shades of... I saw shades of Carrie in here, little shades of It. So there's definitely the more overarching feeling that this is Stephen King's world.
The little girl could have very well been your typical young prodigy who comes up as the chosen one to face the evil. We've seen it many times, but she felt very different to me. She wasn't like this scared little girl who was intimidated by these monsters. She was very confident in her power, and confident in what she was doing that was righteous.
She reminds me of Carrie White, another classic Stephen King character. It almost feels like Abra is what Carrie would have been if she had grown up in a loving household, not with a psychopathic mother, but in a loving, nice household of people who encouraged her to be herself, and if she grew up with a lot more self-confidence. I did like that too, because once she's thrown into the situation, she's not like the scared little kid who has to rise to the occasion and find their inner strength. She comes off right away like, no, I know I'm fucking powerful, and you're not gonna fuck with me. And one of the best parts of the movie is the back and forth play between Rose the Hat and Abra, where they're constantly getting inside of each other's heads, and it becomes almost a game of antagonism with each other. And Abra kind of shows her a few tricks. And that's another cool thing that me and Mike talked about. A lot of the scary scenes, or what you would call the horror scenes in this movie, were not directed towards the good guys. There were horror scenes that were scary that were directed towards the antagonists, the villains, the bad guys, which is not something you see often in horror films. This movie does a good job of selling that this little cult is really evil, and selling their terror and their fear of something out there that might be more powerful than them.
Yeah, especially with Rose the Hat, because she's such a formidable villain. In order to scare her, it really has to be scary, and I felt her fear in those moments when that little girl was attacking her.
Yes, a lot of interesting surrealistic elements that Mike Flanagan has a chance to play with. Ewan McGregor does a great job in the role. He's a believable grown-up Danny Torrance.
And he gets you really invested in his story and the whole struggle of trying to help this little girl. And you're right there with him on every single story beat. And I felt there was a lot of story beats in this.
Yes, a lot.
Like from scene to scene, it would be very important story beats, like one right after another. Mike Flanagan's films have some of the most emotion that I've ever seen between his films and his TV show, The Haunting of Hill House. This movie seemed to come along at the right time in his career. Because back when he did Before I Wake, this one felt like it was going to go the same way as Before I Wake for a while. Really strong first and second act. And then when it got into the third act of Before I Wake, he started pushing the emotion to the sappy level. And then it kind of went over the edge and got really sappy at the end. And this one came right to the edge of being sappy right there at the end. And it was just far enough to where it didn't go too far.
It's a lot more positive and humanistic than Kubrick's version of The Shining is. Yeah. And what's good about it is that It's not a repeat or a retread. It's a completely new story with different strengths than the original The Shining. Obviously, The Shining is the greater film, and it always will be. But as far as sequels go, you can't do much better because this one doesn't try to repeat anything that was done before.
Yeah.
It just adds to the mythology. And it's not even the same type of horror movie. To be honest, they're not even comparable as horror movies, yet they still feel like that they're the same universe.
And I knew I was going to nerd out with all the Shining references and the Shining images, but what I didn't expect is it to feel so much like a part of the movie. Mm-hmm. Like when I went back to the Overlook Hotel, I went back when Danny took me there.
Yes.
It wasn't like he was trying to retread this old nostalgia for this movie. No, when Danny needed to go back there for the story, that's when I went back there with him, and that's what I liked about it.
And it feels necessary to the story to revisit the Overlook Hotel.
Yeah.
Where it could have... and this is why it's successful, even though I don't think it's as scary as Kubrick's visit to the Overlook Hotel. It's successful within the context of this movie because it doesn't feel like it's forced or shoehorned in. It seems natural that the story would take them back to the Overlook Hotel. That would be the only place they would be able to go at that point in the film. Or I'm not going to say what's going on, but by that point in the film, what they're facing, that's the only place that you would be able to go back to. That's like, well, I guess we have to go back to that evil hotel and use it to our benefits and still try not to fall victim to the hotel again.
And it was really satisfying seeing this new character, this new villain, Rose the Hat, go up against these familiar ghosts that we know from the Overlook.
Yes.
I thought that was really satisfying and made me nerd out at the same time.
Well, overall, I loved it. It's one of Mike Flanagan's finest achievements. I don't know if it's his greatest achievement. I'd still say The Haunting of Hill House is probably his greatest achievement, if only because it's bigger and it's all him.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to worry about conforming. But this, as a film, it's a remarkable achievement. Really good, and easily the best Stephen King adaptation this year. I did enjoy It Chapter 2, despite the plethora of problems and flaws that this movie's filled with. This has like all the best stuff of It Chapter 2, with most of the things that I don't like it not existing there. Most of the film's flaws, the things that I didn't like about it, they're not present in this Stephen King adaptation.
So everyone go out and see this movie. We need it to be successful. We need to
support it. Support original horror films.
Or I'll skin your cat and it.
Well, after last week we talked about Hell House LLC. I went to watch Hell House LLC II, the Abaddon Hotel. Mm-hmm. Written, directed by the same director, and apparently this is a trilogy conceived by this director, and he followed it through all the way to the end. And after seeing part 2, I'm really excited to see part 3. I was much more impressed with this part than I was the original. The standouts in this are Vasile Flutour as Mitchell and Kyle Engelman as Brock Davies. It takes place 8 years after the events of the first, and once again begins as a documentary. Well, with the first one, I thought it had a really strong beginning, a really strong setup, and then it got confusing toward the end. This one was just the opposite for me. It got a little confusing at first. I was digging the documentary aspect for a while. It showed the family of the guy from the original, Jackson Mallet, the one that took everybody to the Abaddon Hotel in the first. So his family starts getting texts from him that come from the Abaddon Hotel that say scary shit like, they have no eyes, help me. So it's like the hotel reaching out and trying to draw people to it. And then they show a really creepy home video of him as a kid. He's
more
playing
hotels.
Yeah, the plot thickens when they show him in a home video as he was a kid of him playing that same tune that the piano plays in the Abaddon Hotel. So it shows that the Abaddon Hotel was calling him since he was a little kid. And then he kind of looks at his family and said, the hotel will open in 2009. Really enriches the whole story arc.
More satisfying than the original Hell House LLC, which I liked more than I disliked, but there were significant problems, as we discussed last week, that held it back for me loving it when I felt like it was going in a direction that could have ended with me loving the film.
Yeah.
And it didn't get there.
Shut your mouth or I'll rip your lips off.
Kind of started falling apart in the second act because some of the supporting actors came in and their acting was pretty bad. you can tell that these are really low budget movies, but it's a lot of imagination put in on. It was bad acting, but it wasn't enough to take me out of it. And then when these bad actors were put in a horrific situation, bam, they could act. And you could feel their fear. So it seemed like young actors, they were talented actors who could really pull out the fear and the drama.
If they were directed towards it.
Yeah. But if they were just kind of mundanely talking as themselves, it almost felt like the veneer that we put on, the nicest that we put on for other people, and then when we're put in a fearful situation, kind of that veneer disappears and the real people come out. The bad acting was there for veneer, and then when they were frightened, their real selves came out, and they were completely natural from then on out. And it also has a great scary ending, and even better setup for part 3 than part 1 was a setup for part 2.
So overall, an improvement?
Yes, I'm very excited to see part 3 now. I'll be watching it this week, but I'm not going to discuss it next week because we haven't said it yet. But next week is our 50th
podcast,
our 50th episode on the podcast. So we're going to do our 50 favorite horror films.
You also checked out a film that called My Friend Dahmer, didn't you?
Yeah.
I actually saw this movie, but I didn't get a chance to discuss it on the podcast because if you've been following us for a while, we did our first 15 episodes in succession, and then we took a long break off before. And that's why we call the first 15 episodes Season 1. We did it at a different studio. So we took a long period off before we came back, and this is one of those movies that I watched in the in-between, so now I have a chance to discuss it with you.
I was completely fascinated with this. I thought it was a really important story, and I didn't find out till afterwards. It's based on a book by John Backderf, who's actually one of the characters in the film. He's played by Alex Wolff from Hereditary. But the film was written and directed by Mark Myers, and it's about Jeffrey Dahmer is a high school kid, and he's trying to fit in high school. He makes these friends. They kind of start a Jeffrey Dahmer fan club. They hang out with him and everything, and they're I guess they're his friends. But they're a very mocking version of friends where
I've encountered kids like that in high school who didn't really fit in and still had social crowds, but most of the time they were very strange kids who and since they didn't fit in, they were there more or less for entertainment value or for entertainment purposes for the group, so they're not really real friends.
Yeah.
So I've definitely seen this happen in high school before. I remember the kids like that.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to know these stories and know what happened along the way to turn these people into killers. And I felt that very much, even though it wasn't big indications like, oh yeah, that's going to make him a killer. You could see these morbid fascinations that he had, like picking up dead animals and stuffing them into jars full of acid because he was interested in chemistry because of his dad. I don't think he was really interested in chemistry. He was just interested in the acid and how it dissolved the formerly living things. And then I'm sure the dead animals turned into live animals, and then live animals eventually turned into humans. You don't know exactly what happened along the way. And like with me, I assumed that his high school life was just him being a loner and a weirdo, and then nobody paid attention to him. I didn't know that he actually had a little group of friends. I didn't know he took a girl to the prom. And I didn't know about all these little things that kind of triggered him.
A lot of serial killers have a different trajectory where they never fit in. They never had friends. This seems like if Jeffrey Dahmer had been taken in by a different group of friends, i.e. friends that were actually friends or good people, they could have steered him in a different direction or led him down a different path. But it's the sociopathy that was obviously already present in him, compounded with the fact that I'm pretty sure he was aware that he wasn't being taken advantage of. Yeah. And the movie does a good job of giving you a good sense of who Jeffrey Dahmer was and giving you an objective view of who he was as a kid. Now, a lot of people might feel that it's sentimentalizing him or trying to paint him in a more positive light. I personally don't view it that way because I don't think there's any amount of bullying that could ever justify the crimes that he decided to go through. But you do get to understand why he ended up the way that he did. Most people who are serial killers are not born serial killers. People have to be made that way through society or family, bad school life, and an inability to fit in. It rarely just springs up out of nowhere. And I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of people have the potential to become serial killers, but because of the environment that they grow up in, it doesn't happen. So this is more or less, I feel, a cautionary tale of how we can avoid these things, of how if you see a kid like this, don't treat them that way. You don't want them to end up harming people in the future, and you don't want them to go down that direction. So it's sympathetic towards Jeffrey Dahmer without letting him off the hook for what he became.
Yeah, and it didn't seem like that was the aim of the director, to make you sympathetic toward Jeffrey Dahmer. It seemed like he just...
I apologize for that little pop, folks. We are experiencing technical difficulties at the moment on the podcast, so we apologize if the audio quality is not the same moving forward. But anyways, we'll fix this for next week.
So what I was saying, it seems like the director didn't want to make you sympathetic towards Dahmer. He just wanted to show you the events leading up to his first kill, and I thought it was very effective.
I did too, and it's not a horror movie in the typical sense, the way that it's set up, but it feels like a horror movie, especially in the sense that if you have a sense of history about who Jeffrey Dahmer was, if you're aware of his crimes, it's very clear where he's headed as a human being, where he's headed as a person. You could see it, and that's where the horror comes in, because you fear that even though you already know what happened, the movie does such a good job of involving you in his story as a young person that you're just hoping that something happens that doesn't lead him down this road.
And I thought it was scary, but I thought it was scary because we were inside the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, and that was a very scary place to be. And I felt like it wasn't just scary for the viewer, it was scary for Dahmer.
Yeah.
To have that mind and to have those tendencies. It seemed like it took him a while to embrace them, those tendencies, and it seemed like these were kind of the events that kind of pushed him toward embracing that.
You also get the sense that he knew that he had these tendencies inside of him and was doing his best to keep it under wraps.
Yeah.
Even though ultimately that's not what happened.
He actually goes to the prom with a girl in this, and you think it's almost a turnaround point. You think almost like he's feeling normal in a way, but then one of the kids who had been his so-called friend, who had been manipulating him all this time and kind of taking advantage of him, he apologizes to him, and you would think that would make Dahmer feel better about it, but he seemed to have a revelation at that time when the kid apologized to him. He seemed to have a revelation like, holy shit, you guys were doing this on purpose to me the whole time. Fuck this, fuck you, fuck everybody. That I'm going to take these dark tendencies all the way. This thing with these other kids, it kind of also gave him a taste of fame, and a taste of being weird and out there is going to draw attention to him.
I feel like we've all known kids like that, though.
Yeah.
Every high school has that one kid that's only kept around for the entertainment value of more of kids who are higher up on the social ladder.
Yeah. And you get the feeling like if things would have happened differently, then maybe he would have still been weird, but he would have taken it out in different ways.
In healthier ways.
Yeah, if he would have been more accepted, if his mom hadn't been so crazy, if his dad didn't misunderstand him so badly.
Overall, I really enjoyed it too, and I'm glad that we had the opportunity to talk about it.
But I highly recommend My Friend Dahmer. It's one of the best portraits of a serial killer I've seen.
I agree.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
So the last thing that we're going to discuss on this podcast is American Horror Story 1984. As of the time of this recording, this season ended last night, and this is the shortest season that they've ever had of the series. It was only 9 episodes, but I feel that it worked to its benefit this time because it didn't get drawn out to the point where they didn't know they were doing. This, like Roanoke, I felt like was the most consistent season, along with Roanoke, where like American Horror Story always does, there's extra elements that they add to every subgenre of horror. This one never feels like it goes off the rails away from being a slasher. It just piles on the elements that you expect in slasher movies onto a much greater degree. So there's more killers, more killings, more motivations, more backstabbing, more final girls, and it's packed with story too. It's so packed with story.
Yeah, and it is all over the place in a way, but I think it's very deliberately all over the place.
It feels unified.
Yeah, and it felt like batshit. Like, I couldn't believe that they would introduce another killer, and another killer, and another killer. Everybody's got an ulterior motive, and you don't know what anybody's real intentions are, and then it turns supernatural, and then the victims are killing people, and the killer's not a killer anymore. I just loved all the different places that it went, because it felt like the story felt very chaotic, but very focused at the same time, and that's what I liked about it. And I felt the same thing from Roanoke.
I really loved it too. I loved all the little slasher homages. Did you notice on the second to last episode when Mr. Jingles gets attacked, they totally ape the Friday the 13th, the ending of Friday the 13th with the Jason popping out of the water? It was funny because when the scene was going, I could already tell it was heading in that direction. I was like, watch, some zombie boy is just going to jump out the water right now.
Yeah.
And we're going to get a recreation of that scene. And it did what I expected it to do, but it was still, I was like, yes! They did it the way that I wanted them to do it.
Yeah.
So a lot of really good homages throughout the season, and I felt like it ended on an emotionally satisfying note.
Yeah.
I feel like it has more emotion than a lot of seasons of American Horror Story do, because this one has to do with the redemption of a serial killer, about somebody realizing their past, what they did was... It's more complicated than that. I don't want to spoil it for you, but a lot of it has to do with the redemption of a serial killer and what they will do to square things and make things right with their soul. Really surprised with how well the emotional elements of the story are handled. And fucking Emma Roberts, she did a fantastic job in this one.
She was good. The guy that played Richard Ramirez was really good. All the way up to the end. He was a very big part of it. Much bigger part than I expected.
We had speculated from the very beginning as to how much Richard Ramirez was going to be involved. I never would have predicted that he was going to be a character for the entire season and an integral part of the storyline. And one of the cool things that what I've always liked about American Horror Story is how it takes very fantastic elements of horror stuff that's not realistic and mixes it with real life events. So the scene where Richard Ramirez gets caught and gets sent to prison is exactly how it happened when he was in a Chicano neighborhood and he was recognized in the streets. So when they chased him down in that neighborhood, that's what really happened. He was recognized from a sketch from the newspaper, and he was chased and beaten down. That was really cool to see it incorporated with the fictional story that they have going on the other side. So it's a very interesting blending of fact and fiction, like American Horror Story always does.
And a very satisfying ending to Richard Ramirez's story, too.
Yes.
What happened to him at the end? Very gory.
Unsung hero for this season for me was John Carroll Lynch as Mr. Jingles.
Yeah.
He did a great job of projecting the menace of a serial killer. He had the demeanor of an 80s slasher movie villain. He definitely had that feeling, but when he was called upon for more emotional elements and when the story took the character in different directions, he delivered on that end as well.
Yeah.
And then Finn Wittrock, who's been in past seasons of American Horror Story, comes out for the final episode, and that was really good. He played a really good part. And even though he's a character that's just tacked on only at the end, it feels natural. It doesn't feel like, and now we're going to introduce you to more stories as this goes on.
Yeah.
And I love that most of it takes place in 1984. Most of it takes place from 84 to 89, and it dips a little bit into the present time, which is kind of cool. So you get to see a sprawling story, and the ending of it, which I'm not going to ruin, is total 80s cheese in the best way that you could tell they wanted to go out saying, this was our tribute to the 80s. And they go so far as to have a character in the show say the 80s will never die.
Yeah.
And it's kind of true. I mean, look how much 80s nostalgia, how much shit is based on 80s throwbacks for that era.
Yeah, and for the first part of the episode, it was very story heavy. So I thought, okay, this is going to be very story heavy to wrap up all these stories and subplots and everything. But so I didn't think it was going to be as gory as it began. But holy shit, it got gory, and then got gorier and gorier, and some of the goriest things I've ever seen on cable TV.
I'm kind of and FX has not always been known to push the envelope as far as what content is allowed on basic cable.
Yeah.
I was still generally surprised by the amount of gore that they actually put into this.
It was nasty throat slits.
Yeah, not something I would have expected. And as risque as American Horror Story has been in the past, I would not have expected the FX or the network censors to allow this much graphic violence into it. So kudos, they did a good job without making it feel like it was compromised at all. If this were a movie, it would not have been rated PG-13. I can say that.
No.
There's way too much violence for this to have ever been rated PG-13.
Yeah. Gushing blood. Not just blood, gushing blood.
So all in all, I think it's one of American Horror Story's most satisfying seasons.
Yeah.
And probably the single funnest season they've ever done. One that just is a pure blast from start to finish. I feel seasons of American Horror Story that have been more ambitious than this one.
Yeah.
Ones that have been a little bit more serious.
Yeah, I thought it was pure entertainment, and it was everything that I liked about American Horror Story. Just the right amount of camp, just the right amount of seriousness, just the right amount of zany characters, and some of them it was their best season, some of the characters.
Yeah, and really, Ryan Murphy really stuck the landing on this one.
Yeah.
Good job to the cast, the crew, the writers, everybody involved. I thoroughly enjoyed American Horror Story 1984. And when the title card comes up at the end when it says AHS 1984, I smiled to myself because, yeah, I felt like I saw a really cool long-form slasher story.
Yeah, and I think we're both kind of disappointed that we're not going to see that opening credit sequence anymore.
Yeah.
It's so good.
The best opening... And American Horror Stories has always had fantastic opening credit sequences. How each one is a little bit different, but they all have somewhat of the same thing and they skew towards the theme of the season. Mm. This one was the most radically different and the one that felt the most different. Easily the best intro. And it's one of those times where a lot of shows, when I'm watching them, I'll skip past the intro because I just want to get to the show, especially if I've seen the intro. I'd never wanted to skip past the intro anytime I watched it. Yeah. It felt like it was part of the fabric, or I felt like I was missing out on something. Yeah. If I did skip it.
There was even one time that I accidentally hit fast forward just by habit to go past the intro, and I had to rewind it just to watch it.
Well, we are running out of time, folks, and our sound quality is not as good as we would like it to be, but we're going to fix that for the next season. We're going to fix that for the next episode.
Yeah, and we didn't get to discuss the end of Creepshow. We wanted to discuss it as a full season, but we will discuss that in the next couple of weeks. But next week we'll be doing. Next week is our 50th episode. We're going to be doing our top 50 favorite horror films. So tune in for that.
Yeah. And
of course, check us out every Friday on the American Horrors channel. Again, we're coming back Friday the 13th in December, and are doing our last 3 episodes. So check us out. Facebook.com/Pickles Horror Show for all the info, or Instagram @Pickles Horror Show.
All right. Until next week, folks. Happy horror.